Today, we're diving deep into the man behind some of the most iconic plays of the 20th century. We're talking about Thomas Lanier Williams III, but of course, you know him as Tennessee Williams.
Mm-hmm.
And we're looking at an artist who didn't just write plays. It feels more like he meticulously transcribed his own life onto the stage, creating these just haunting and unforgettable American dramas.
Yeah, you really can't talk about 20th century American drama without putting him right there in that, that top tier. It's always O'Neill, Miller, and Williams.
The big three.
The big three. And our sources are all in agreement on this. But what's so fascinating is that, while O'Neill was mining the classics and Miller was mining the social conscience, Williams, well, he was mining himself. His entire output is like this massive prolonged act of public therapy.
That's a great way to put it. And that's exactly the mission for this deep dive. We have this mountain of documentation here, detailing his just incredibly tumultuous personal history.
Everything. His frail childhood, the explosive family, the volatile love life, the addiction.
And we want to trace the explicit, direct lines. I mean, how did all that personal suffering become the icon's success?
We are going behind the curtain, quite literally, to look at the blueprint. It's a classic story, but also a profoundly tragic one. Here's an artist whose success was basically built on his inability to escape his own past.
He was fueling his art with his own pain.
Exactly. Self-exhibition was his primary source of fuel, and the result was just sheer brilliance.
And the timeline of it all is almost shocking. The sources really highlight this intense contrast. You have decades of struggle, of obscurity.
Yeah, writing like a fiend while working these menial, just soul-crushing jobs.
And then all of a sudden this massive eruption into fame. He's 33 years old, and the Glass Menagerie hits in 1944.
And think about what that kind of overnight validation does to you. The world is suddenly saying, your pain is worth listening to.
And worth paying for.
Right. And that's a huge psychological shift. It secures his legacy, for sure, but it doesn't solve the underlying internal fracture. In a lot of ways, that validation only amplified the raw material, It set up the central tension of his life, this massive public recognition that was built entirely on private, internalized suffering.
So let's start where all that darkness began, the family home. He was born Thomas Lanier Williams III on March 26, 1911, in Columbus, Mississippi.
And he didn't even adopt the name Tennessee Williams until much later, around 1939.
And it wasn't just a quirky pen name, was it?
No, not at all. It was a very conscious acknowledgement of his Southern roots, his accent. It was a way of grounding himself in this culture that he also, spent his whole life trying to escape.
Yeah.
The South wasn't just geography for Williams. It was destiny.
The site of the original trauma.
Exactly. And the immediate crucible was his family. I mean, to really get the explosive atmosphere of a play like A Streetcar named Desire, or the suffocating politeness of The Glass Menagerie, you have to understand the marriage of his parents, Edwina Dakin and Cornelius Coffin Williams. C.C. Williams.
A relationship defined by extremes. C.C., the father, was a traveling shoe salesman. He was away a lot, but his presence was always felt.
Oh, yeah. A terrifying, volatile temper fueled by alcoholism. And the sources are crystal clear on this. C.C. developed this intense disdain for his son, Thomas, for what he saw as effeminacy.
This is more than just a dad being disappointed.
It's a profound conflict of identities. Williams was seen as frail, sensitive, artistic. And C.C., this rough, hard-drinking, aggressively masculine guy, he just saw all of that as weakness.
So he's immediately the outsider in his own home.
Right, perpetually trying to define himself against this aggressive male presence.
And that perception of physical weakness, the very thing his father scorned, it was rooted in a real early trauma.
It was. As a young child, he contracted a nearly fatal case of diphtheria.
And this episode is just critical to his entire psychological makeup.
It really is. It left him frail, prone to illness, short in stature, and this is the crucial part. Confined to the house for an entire year of recuperation.
A whole year.
Imagine that. You're a kid, you're vulnerable, you're locked away, and you're constantly being reminded of your physical shortcomings by a father who is judging you for it. It created this immediate visceral sense of alienation that just became the bedrock of his literary output.
So the physical body fails, and that leads to this psychological prison. And meanwhile, you have his mother, Edwina Dakin, who's trapped in her own unhappy marriage.
And she responds by focusing pretty much all of her attention on her frail young son.
Edwina was the daughter of an Episcopal priest, right?
Yes, and she carried with her this highly refined but also very stifling puritanical gentility. Williams actually spent a lot of his early childhood in his grandfather's rectory.
So you have these two opposing destructive forces shaping him,
Totally. The aggressive, alcoholic contempt of the father on one side.
and the overbearing, almost suffocating religious restraint of the mother's side on the other.
It's the origin story of Amanda Wingfield and Stanley Kowalski, isn't it? The parents weren't just background characters, they were the primary living source material.
And the critics and historians all seem to agree on that.
Overwhelmingly. Williams was driven by a need to escape that Puritan upbringing, to escape the emotional constraints of his early life. Writing wasn't a choice for him, it was an exit strategy.
The act of documenting and transforming their dysfunction was his only way out.
Precisely. He wasn't inventing characters so much as he was dissecting family members and reassembling them on a stage where he, the writer, finally had control.
You'd think that would be a formula for early success, but that really wasn't the case. He wasn't some academic prodigy.
Not at all. His formal education was very fragmented. He went to the University of Missouri in 1929 for journalism, but he got bored pretty quickly.
He was already more interested in writing plays.
Way more interested. He was submitting them to contests, hoping to win prize money. He actually got an honorable mention for a play called Beauty is the Word, which, tellingly, was already about rebelling against a religious upbringing. That core conflict was there from the start.
But the real formative experience, the source of that blue-collar grit that contrasts so powerfully with the fragility of his heroines, that came when his schooling was violently interrupted.
This is the moment where his father, C.C., just asserts his control one last time. Williams failed a military training course during his junior year.
Which would have infuriated his father.
Oh, it did. And in response, C.C. pulled him out of the university and put him to work at the International Shoe Company factory in St. Louis.
That must have been pure torture for someone like him.
It was. Our sources call this the aha moment for his career, but at the time it felt like pure misery. He worked a job he hated. Clerking, typing, filing, just the drudgery of the 9-to-5 machine, surrounded by men he couldn't relate to.
But his hatred for it became his creative engine.
It absolutely did. He didn't just passively hate it. He channeled that energy into this almost obsessive writing schedule. He was driven by pure desperation.
He set himself a goal of 1 story per week. That's incredible.
It's unbelievable. His mother, Edwina, later remembered this incredibly poignant image of him. She'd find him sprawled, fully dressed across his bed, just too exhausted to even get undressed, but the typewriter had been clicking away all through the night.
That image.
Yeah.
The writer, fueled by desperation, just churning out content as a survival mechanism. It's not dedication, it's a plea for rescue.
Absolutely. The need to generate enough income to survive, to escape the factory, to escape his father's house, it gave his early work this edge and this profound urgency, and the material he gathered there was pure gold.
The sources confirm that.
Explicitly. The memories of that period, the aggressive, low-class environment, and especially the bullying nature of a coworker he knew, that was the direct genetic material for Stanley Kowalski.
So the brutish male force that haunted his life, his father, the factory, it all coalesced into this single muscular figure of Stanley.
The very personification of the world he feared and, at the same time, needed to articulate to understand. But that job and the relentless pressure, it eventually broke him.
He was overworked, deeply unhappy.
And still largely unsuccessful commercially. He suffered a nervous breakdown around his 24th birthday. That's when he was finally able to leave the factory. The breakdown was his escape route.
And he eventually went back to school, finishing his degree at the University of Iowa in 1938.
Right. But those early years, the frailty, the puritanical mother, the abusive father, the factory grind, that's the DNA. That's where the menagerie of fragile characters and violent forces was born.
And success was still a long way off. I mean, we're talking about things like his short story, The Vengeance of Nitocris, published in Weird Tales in 1928.
Right, which is a fun detail, but it certainly wasn't the material that would make him famous. It was a decade and more of struggle after that.
Okay, so let's move into the late 1930s. Williams is the quintessential struggling artist.
He really is, hopping from one menial job to the next. We know he worked as a caretaker on a chicken ranch in Laguna Beach, California.
Which sounds like something out of one of his plays.
Doesn't it? Then, in 1939, he got a small grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, which was a huge help. But his first play, produced with that money, Battle of Angels, it was poorly received in Boston. So he's putting in the work, but the public just wasn't there yet.
But that funding did lead him to a transformative change of scenery. He used some of it to move to New Orleans.
And New Orleans offered him a freedom, a sense of creative and personal liberation that, restrictive St. Louis never could. The French Quarter was the perfect backdrop for him.
He was finding his identity there.
Absolutely. He even worked briefly for the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. He lived at 722 Toulouse Street, a residence that would later become the setting for his 1977 play, Vieux Carré.
So the geography was inspiring, but the professional eruption, the one that changed everything, that didn't happen until 1944.
The breakthrough was the glass menagerie. And it's important to note, this play wasn't conjured from thin air. It was developed from a short story he wrote in 1943 called Portrait of a Girl in Glass.
And the structure he chose for it, the memory play, that was revolutionary.
It was, and it was perfectly suited to his highly personal material.
Let's pause on that idea of the memory play. Why was that specific structure so vital for what Williams was trying to do?
That's a great question, because a traditional play presents events as objective reality, right? As they happen. A memory play, though, is filtered entirely through the mind of a narrator.
In this case, Tom Wingfield, the character based directly on Williams.
Exactly. And this structure allows for an unreliable narration, fragmented time, selective lighting, music, all these non-realistic devices. It gives him permission to be subjective. The audience isn't watching a literal history, they're watching a dreamscape of trauma.
So the fragility of Laura, Amanda's desperation, Tom's guilt, it all feels more immediate and unavoidable.
Right. And it premiered in Chicago, moved to New York, and the sources say it was an instant hit. It won the New York Drama Critics Circle Award. At 33, he went from total obscurity to a major cultural figure.
And the connection between the art and his life must have been immediately apparent to everyone around him.
Oh, it was impossible to miss. Elia Kazan, who directed so many of Williams' greatest successes, he summed it up perfectly. He said, everything in his life is in his plays, and everything in his plays is in his life.
It's the perfect summation.
It is. The glass menagerie worked because it was so transparently raw, so specific to his trauma, yet so universal in how it depicted family failure.
And the success of Menagerie launched him into his peak decade, roughly 1947 to 1961.
Right.
This is where he goes from celebrated playwright to American icon.
The follow-up masterpiece, A Streetcar Named Desire, lands in 1947, and it didn't just build on Menagerie. It exploded the boundaries of what American theater could address.
And it won him his first Pulitzer Prize in 1948.
Yep. Then the success just keeps rolling, culminating in his second Pulitzer for Cat on a Hot Tin Roof in 1955. But the sources reveal this fascinating, almost scandalous detail about that second Pulitzer.
It wasn't a sure thing.
Not by a long shot. It's this incredible piece of literary boardroom drama. The Pulitzer jury initially preferred a completely different play, The Flowering Peach by Clifford Odets.
Wow. So where did Cat on a Hot Tin Roof rank for them?
The sources state that the initial jury panel actually considered it the weakest of the 5 shortlisted nominees.
The weakest? That's staggering, given its legacy. Why did they resist it?
It was likely the boldness of the themes, the ambiguous nature of Briggs' sexuality, the blunt, aggressive way the play dealt with greed and decay and lies. Williams was always pushing boundaries, and sometimes the establishment, well, they balked.
So how did it end up winning then?
This is where the power of Williams's reputation and one very powerful man comes in. Joseph Pulitzer Jr., the chairman of the board and the grandson of the prize's founder, had seen the production.
And he loved it.
He believed strongly that it was worthy of the prize. He argued its artistic merit just superseded the jury's reservations. After a lot of debate, the board went along with him. They overrode the jury's recommendation.
That says a lot about the sheer weight of Williams's influence by the mid-50s.
Absolutely. And that whole era was just defined by success. You have The Rose Tattoo in 51, Sweet Bird of Youth in 59, The Night of the Iguana in 61. By 1959, he had 3 New York Drama Critics Circle Awards, 3 Donaldson Awards at Tony. He was the undisputed king of American theater.
And critically, his vision reached way beyond the theater through all the film adaptations. That was huge, especially in the very conservative 1950s.
That's the true measure of his societal impact. By adapting these plays for the screen, his deeply personal, often taboo themes, homosexuality, mental instability, alcoholism, raw desire, they were brought directly to mass audiences. He wasn't just entertaining, he was fundamentally challenging society's ideas about sex, family, and mental health.
So he becomes this public icon of literary success. But as we pivot now, the sources of that genius were also the inescapable sources of his deepest private pain. The success didn't stop the internal bleeding.
No, it didn't. And if Williams had one single defining personal trauma that shaped his entire worldview, it centers on his older sister, Rose Isabel Williams. She wasn't just a character model for him, she was a living martyr. Her tragedy just irrevocably shaped his art and his life.
It's a truly heartbreaking story. Rose was diagnosed with schizophrenia as a young woman, and in 1943, the family made this catastrophic decision to have her subjected to a prefrontal lobotomy.
Which led to her being institutionalized for the rest of her life. And look at that timing again. 1943. This tragedy is unfolding right as he's finally finding fame with the Glass Menagerie.
The two events, the loss of his sister's mind and the explosion of his career, they're forever linked in his psyche.
He carried immense guilt over it. He felt he hadn't protected her, that he hadn't intervened strongly enough against their mother, Edwina.
And he responded with this profound lifelong loyalty. As soon as the royalties started coming in, he moved Rose to a private institution, visited her often, and gave her a percentage interest in several of his most successful plays.
Think about that. The profits generated from his art born directly from that family trauma, were used to pay for the lifelong care of the woman who's suffering to find that trauma. It's this endless, self-feeding cycle of genius and guilt.
And the connection to his characters is just undeniable. Rose was the direct model for Laura Wingfield, the fragile, glass-collecting daughter in the Glass Menagerie.
But it didn't stop there. Biographers agree her mental deterioration profoundly influenced Blanche Dubois in Streetcar, her descent into fantasy when faced with harsh reality.
And he used the lobotomy itself as a motif in his later work.
Specifically in Suddenly, last summer. So whether it's the fragile beauty of Laura, the desperate fantasy of Blanche, or the horror of the surgery, his sister's tragedy is just woven into the DNA of his masterpieces.
And the personal toll must have been devastating.
It was. The sources directly connect Rose's fate and Williams's deep, constant fear of inheriting her insanity to his later struggles with alcoholism and his escalating dependence on a dangerous cocktail of amphetamines and barbiturates.
He was trying to self-medicate, to outrun the genetic ghost of madness.
And that inner turmoil spilled over into his romantic life, which was always intense, always unstable, especially once he entered the New York gay social circle in the late 30s.
His early relationships were pretty dramatic. In 1940, he fell for a young dancer named Kip Kiernan.
And the relationship ended when Kip left him to marry a woman. Williams was completely distraught. That anguish was compounded when Kip died just 4 years later.
And he channeled that heartbreak into his work.
Into a play called The Parade. Then there was the volatility of Pancho Rodriguez y Gonzalez, who he met in 1945. This was a really tempestuous relationship, full of jealous rages and heavy drinking. Not a calm period, but again, all fodder for his work.
But for all that turbulence, there was one long, enduring relationship that gave him stability during his most productive period. Frank Merlo.
Merlo was an occasional actor, a WWII vet. They met in New York, and he became the enduring romantic relationship of Williams's life. It lasted 14 years. He was the exception to the rule of chaos.
How did Merlo provide that stability? Was it more of an artistic thing, or was it practical?
It was profoundly practical, which is what Williams desperately needed. Merlo acted as his personal secretary, handling the mail, the domestic details, all the things Williams, who was prone to depression, just couldn't manage.
So Merlo managed the noise so Williams could focus on writing.
He did. And our sources confirm that those years, living between their apartment in Manhattan and their house in Key West, were consistently described as Williams's happiest and most productive.
But that kind of stability rarely lasts for someone like him.
No. It collapsed due to mutual infidelity and escalating drug and alcohol abuse on both sides. The relationship ended, and then, shortly after, tragedy struck again. Merlo was diagnosed with inoperable lung cancer.
And Williams, despite their breakup, he went back to care for him.
He did, right up until Merlo's death in September 1963. It shows a deep, enduring affection there. But Merlo's death was a pivotal moment. It marks the end of Williams's golden age of stability and the beginning of a sharp personal decline.
This cycle of stability and collapse seems to fuel this constant need for external change. There's an incredible quote from Williams that encapsulates this.
He said, "Only some radical change can divert the downward course of my spirit. Some startling new place or people to arrest the drift, the drag."
That's the key, isn't it? He thought he could outrun the drag of his spirit just by changing continents.
Or relationships. New Orleans, Key West, Rome, Barcelona. Every location became a backdrop or a source of characters. The world, in his mind, was just material to be processed into art, a way to justify his own constant restlessness.
So Merlo's death in 1963 really kicks off what sources call the decade of turmoil.
And beyond. The loss plunged him into a period of nearly catatonic depression. This was compounded by his increasing dependence on substances, leading to multiple hospitalizations, even forced commitments.
This is the era where his chemical dependence becomes central to his story. He starts visiting Dr. Max Jacobson, the notorious Dr. Feelgood.
Right. Jacobson was giving him amphetamines, basically speed, to combat the depression. But of course, because speed makes you incapable of sleeping, Williams also had prescriptions for heavy sedatives, often Seconal, to knock him out at night.
That specific cocktail uppers during the day, downers at night, it must have been devastating to his mental clarity.
It was a recipe for cognitive decline. He was constantly riding this chemical roller coaster, which just prevented him from ever truly getting back to his earlier success, even though he never stopped writing.
The volume of his later work is staggering.
It is a real testament to his dedication, but the quality,
Yeah.
sadly, it suffered.
Why do you think the quality dropped off so dramatically? Was it just the drugs, or did audiences and critics just move on?
I think it's a combination. The drugs certainly impaired his judgment and instruction, leading to plays that felt less polished. But the theatrical landscape was changing too. Critics who had once hailed him as a genius grew impatient with his unrelenting darkness.
They saw it as repetitive.
They did. Plays like Vieux Carré and Close for a Summer Hotel were box office failures, and that just wore down his spirit.
It must have been crushing to have been the greatest playwright in America and then face constant rejection.
Absolutely. Even his final production, A House Not Meant to Stand, in 1982, got decent reviews, but it only ran for 40 performances. The monumental heights of the 40s and 50s were just, they were gone.
And the end, when it came, was sadly chaotic, perfectly mirroring the turbulence of his life.
On February 25, 1983, Tennessee Williams was found dead at 71 in his suite at the Hotel Elysée in New York. The initial media reports were just shocking and bizarre.
The story was that he choked to death on a plastic cap from an eye solution bottle.
Right, a horrific and dramatic story. But the sources provide a crucial correction that ties his death directly back to his life struggles.
What was the final verdict?
The corrected medical report, issued later that year, clarified that while he had been using the cap to help ingest barbiturates, the actual cause of death was a toxic level of secobarbital in his system. It was an accidental overdose, stemming directly from the chemical dependence that had plagued him for 20 years.
A devastating footnote. And even in death, his final intensely dramatic wish was denied.
It was such a powerful final statement. His 1972 will stated he wanted to be sewn up in a canvas sack and dropped overboard at sea.
And not just anywhere. He wanted to be close to where the poet Hart Crane had committed suicide.
He wanted his body to follow the narrative arc of the tragic artist who chooses his own dramatic, watery end. It was the ultimate, carefully curated final act.
But it didn't happen.
No. His brother, Dakin, overrode the wish and had him buried in Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis next to their mother. He was not granted the final, spectacular exit he wrote for himself.
Despite the messiness of his final decades, his legacy is absolutely rock solid.
Financially, his legacy is one of the greatest full-circle moments you could imagine. Most of his estate was left in trust for his sister Rose. After she died, the bulk of that money, about $7 million, went to the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee, to support a creative writing program.
So the profit from transcribing his family's pain now funds the next generation of Southern writers. That's incredible.
It is. And he received plenty of honors. The American Theater Hall of Fame, the Poets' Corner. His name is on festivals in New Orleans and St. Louis, a theater in Key West. His work is constantly revived, constantly relevant.
It brings us back to that great metaphor, the New Orleans streetcars. Gore Vidal had that wonderful, reflective quote.
He did. Vidal noted that in New Orleans, one streetcar was named Desire and the other was called Cemeteries. To get where you were going, you changed from the first to the second. In his stories and in those plays, Tennessee validated with his genius our common ticket of transfer.
That is just a chillingly perfect summary. The entire Williams oeuvre is that journey. The constant burning pursuit of desire, leading inevitably through the dark streets toward the cemetery.
So if we boil down the key takeaways from this deep dive, they all come back to that fundamental contract Williams made with his art. His work succeeded because he enacted this direct, unflinching translation of his family's dysfunction and his own personal pain into something universal.
He proved that the most specific details of a life, a glass collection, a stifling apartment, could become the universal canvas for human fragility.
Exactly. And second, you're left with this jarring contrast. The playwright, whose professional life was marked by the highest honors, Pulitzers, Tonys, and whose private life was defined by this profound instability, fueled by addiction, depression, and the inescapable fear of his sister's insanity.
The escape through fame was always temporary.
Always. And that tension desire leading to the cemetery leaves us with a final provocative thought. Williams's life and death, right up to his burial request, it all underscores that fundamental human battle. It wasn't just a theme for him.
It was his lived experience.
Right. And he was still fighting that battle on the page until the very end. It's worth considering that he was relentlessly working on a final piece, in masks outrageous and austere, right up until he died.
And the sources suggest this was his ultimate attempt to reconcile everything.
To reconcile the certain forces and facts of his own life, to finally integrate desire and the cemetery madness in art. The ultimate tragedy might be that his final curtain closed before he could achieve that reconciliation on the stage. So you have to ask yourself, did he find some kind of peace in those final unproduced words? Or was the ultimate unavoidable truth that there was no narrative solution to his life? It's something to mull over as you reconsider the brilliance and the brutal honesty of his work.